In the harsh winter of 1887, three small figures huddled together on the steps of St. Catherine's Home for Children in Cedar Falls, Montana Territory, clutching nothing but a crumpled letter and each other's hands. The oldest was barely 14, the youngest not yet 7, and between them stretched a bond forged not by blood alone, but by a promise whispered over their mother's grave that they would never be separated. What they didn't know was that 50 miles away, a giant of a man named Samuel Torres was staring at his empty ranch house, wondering if the echo of his own footsteps would be the only sound to fill those rooms for the rest of his days. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning bell at St. Catherine's rang sharp and cold through the November air, cutting through the frost that clung to the dormitory windows like desperate fingers. Emma Hartwell sat up first, as she always did, her 14-year-old shoulders already carrying the weight of responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. Beside her, 10-year-old Clara stirred beneath the thin woolen blanket they shared, while 7-year-old Lucy remained curled tight as a sleeping fox, her thumb tucked between her lips despite Emma's constant gentle corrections. 3 beds over, Margaret O'Sullivan was already awake, watching them with the calculating eyes of a woman who had seen too many children come and go through these walls. At 62, she had been running St. Catherine's for nearly 2 decades, and she had learned to read the signs. The Hartwell sisters had been here 8 months now, and the letters were piling up on her desk. Families wanted single children, preferably young ones, boys for farm work, girls for household help. Nobody wanted 3 sisters who refused to be separated. Emma swung her feet over the edge of the narrow bed, her toes immediately meeting the shock of the cold wooden floor. The dormitory held 12 beds, but only 7 were occupied now. Winter always brought fewer new arrivals and more departures, as families looked for extra hands to help weather the harsh months ahead. She glanced at the empty beds and felt a familiar tightness in her chest. How many mornings had she woken to find another child gone, taken by strangers to places she would never see again? The daily routine never changed. Morning prayers, porridge, with milk when there was enough, lessons with whatever books the church ladies could spare, and chores that kept their hands busy from dawn until dusk. Emma had become expert at mending clothes with thread pulled from old garments, at making watery soup taste like something worth eating with wild herbs she gathered behind the building, at telling stories that could make Lucy forget she was hungry. Clara had found her own ways to survive. She could calculate numbers faster than any of the older children, a skill that had caught the attention of several families looking for help with their ledgers and accounts. But every time Mother O'Sullivan called her to the front parlor to meet potential adoptive parents, Clara would find reasons to mention her sisters. She would speak of Emma's talent for healing wounded animals, of Lucy's gift for remembering every song she'd ever heard. The families would nod politely, but their interest would cool like coffee left too long on a windowsill. Lucy, the youngest, had adapted with the resilience that only small children possess. She had befriended every stray cat that wandered near. The orphanage could coax birds to eat from her palm, and had somehow managed to make even Mother O'Sullivan's stern face soften when she would curl up in the woman's lap during evening prayers. But Lucy also had nightmares that would wake the entire dormitory, sobbing for a mother who would never answer, and it was always Emma who would gather her close and sing the lullabies their mother had hummed while hanging laundry on summer afternoons, that now felt like dreams from another life. The Hartwell sisters had arrived at St. Catherine's on a wagon, driven by their elderly neighbor, Mr. Benjamin Fletcher, whose own failing health had made it impossible for him to care for 3 grieving children. Their parents had died within days of each other during the influenza outbreak that had swept through their small farming community of Millbrook, leaving behind a mortgaged homestead, 3 daughters, and debts that would take years to settle. Emma remembered every detail of that last morning in their real home. Clara had braided Lucy's hair with yellow ribbons their mother had saved in her sewing box. Emma had packed their few belongings into a single carpet bag, carefully wrapping their mother's china teacup in one of their father's old shirts. Lucy had insisted on bringing her corn-husk doll, the one their mother had made during the long winter evenings when the wind howled around their little house like a living thing. At St. Catherine's, they learned quickly that the world had little patience for sentiment. The china teacup was deemed impractical and stored away. The corn-husk doll was considered childish for a girl of 7 who needed to learn responsibility. Even the yellow ribbons were replaced with plain brown ones that wouldn't show dirt as easily. But Emma had hidden small treasures in the folds of her dress, in the lining of Clara's shoes, in the deepest pocket of Lucy's coat, a button from their father's favorite shirt, a dried violet from their mother's garden, a small, smooth stone from the creek where they used to play on Sunday afternoons. The orphanage operated on strict schedules and stricter rules. Breakfast at 6, lessons from 8 until noon, chores until supper, prayers and bed by 8 o'clock. Speaking during meals was discouraged. Laughter was permitted but not encouraged. Crying was understood but not indulged. The children who thrived were those who could make themselves useful without making themselves noticed. Emma had tried to master this balance, but her protective instincts made invisibility impossible. When Thomas Brennan, a boy 2 years older and considerably meaner, had pulled Lucy's hair during morning prayers, Emma had responded with a swift elbow to his ribs that left him gasping and earned her 3 days of extra kitchen duty. When Sarah Mills had claimed Clara's primer as her own, Emma had calmly retrieved it and stared the older girl down until she found somewhere else to sit. When Mother O'Sullivan had suggested that perhaps the sisters would be happier if they learned to be more independent of each other, Emma had replied with a politeness so cold it could have frosted windows. Clara had her own quiet rebellions. She would deliberately make small mistakes in her sums when prospective families tested her arithmetic skills, or she would mention that she sometimes had terrible headaches that made it hard to concentrate. Once, when a well-dressed couple had seemed particularly interested in adopting her alone, she had spent the entire interview speaking only in the few words of German their father had taught them, pretending she couldn't understand English well, enough to be useful. Lucy's defiance was more innocent, but no less effective. She had an uncanny ability to become suddenly, violently ill whenever separation seemed imminent. She would develop mysterious fevers, stomach ailments that left her pale and listless, or coughs that sounded far worse than they were. Mother O'Sullivan had initially suspected these illnesses were genuine, but as the pattern became clear, she began to recognize them for what they were, a 7-year-old's desperate attempt to remain with the only family she had left. The letters had begun arriving in September. The first was from a farming family in Great Falls who needed help with their growing children and had heard about Clara's skill with numbers. The second came from a merchant's wife in Billings who was looking for a young girl to help with household duties and had been impressed by Emma's maturity. The third was from an elderly couple in Helena who wanted to provide a good Christian home for a small child and had been charmed by Lucy's sweet disposition. Mother O'Sullivan had read each letter carefully, had prayed over them during her evening devotions, and had filed them away in the wooden box she kept locked in her office desk. She had seen too many siblings torn apart, had witnessed the grief that followed such separations, and she had hoped that a solution might present itself that would allow the Hartwell sisters to remain together. But winter was coming, and the orphanage's resources were stretched thin. The church funding that kept St. Catherine's operating came with expectations, and one of those expectations was that children would be placed in homes where they could contribute to family life while receiving proper care and education. Keeping three sisters together when they could be providing help to three separate families was becoming increasingly difficult to justify. The daily routines continued, but underneath the surface, tension was building like pressure in a kettle. Emma could see it in the way Mother O'Sullivan's eyes would linger on them during morning prayers, in the careful way she spoke to visitors who came looking for children to adopt, in the growing stack of correspondence on her desk that she thought the children hadn't noticed. Emma had developed the habit of rising before the morning bell, using those quiet moments to plan and worry in equal measure. She would stand at the frost-covered window, looking out at the mountains that surrounded Cedar Falls like sleeping giants, and try to imagine a future where she and her sisters could stay together. But every scenario she constructed seemed to crumble under the weight of practical concerns. They had no money, no relatives who could take them in, no skills valuable enough to earn their keep as a group. Clara spent her free time in the orphanage's small library, reading everything she could find about homesteading laws, about children who had made their own way in the world, about places where three sisters might find work together. She had discovered that in some territories, families were so desperate for help that they would take in multiple children, but those opportunities seemed as distant and unreachable as the stars that wheeled overhead on clear winter nights. Lucy had begun hoarding small treasures with the intensity of a squirrel preparing for a harsh winter. She kept a collection of pretty buttons, smooth pebbles, dried flowers, and scraps of colorful fabric hidden beneath her mattress. When Emma asked her about it, Lucy had explained with 7-year-old logic that if they had to leave, she wanted to have beautiful things to remember their time together. The other children at St. Catherine's had learned not to form attachments too quickly or too deeply. They had seen too many friendships ended by sudden departures, too many promises broken by circumstances beyond anyone's control. But they watched the Hartwell sisters with a mixture of admiration and pity, understanding both the strength of their bond and the impossibility of their situation. November brought the first real snow, thick and heavy and persistent. It blanketed the mountains and the valleys, turned the world into a study in white and grey, and the deep green of pine trees bending under winter's weight. The orphanage's heating stove worked overtime, but drafts still found their way through. Gaps in the walls, and the children learned to sleep in layers, sharing body warmth like puppies in a basket. It was during one of these cold nights that Emma made a decision that would change everything. She had lain awake listening to Clara's steady breathing, to Lucy's occasional murmurs as she dreamed, to the wind rattling the windows like an insistent visitor. She had thought about the letters Mother O'Sullivan kept locked away, about the families who wanted to separate them, about the approaching spring that would bring new opportunities and new pressures to find homes for the children in their care. Emma rose quietly, careful not to wake her sisters, and made her way to the kitchen, where a single lamp was kept burning through the night. She found paper and pencil, and by the flickering light, she began to write her own letter, not to a potential adoptive family, but to anyone who might be willing to give three sisters a chance to prove they were worth more together than apart. She wrote about Clara's gift with numbers, about Lucy's gentle way with animals, about her own willingness to work harder than any single child to earn their keep. She wrote about the promise they had made to their dying mother, about the strength they drew from each other, about the fierce loyalty that made them valuable as a unit, rather than as separate individuals. When the letter was finished, Emma folded it carefully and tucked it inside her dress. She didn't know where she would send it, or if anyone would ever read it, but writing it had given her something she hadn't felt in months, a sense of possibility, however fragile, that their story might not end with separation and goodbye. The next morning brought news that would test every plan Emma had ever made, every hope she had ever harbored, and every bond that held the three sisters together. Mother O'Sullivan called them to her office after breakfast, her face wearing the expression that all the children had learned to fear, the look of someone who had made a difficult decision and would not be swayed from it. 3 chairs had been arranged in front of her desk. 3 letters lay open beside her folded hands, and in that moment Emma realized that their time together at St. Catherine's was coming to an end, whether they were ready or not. Mother O'Sullivan's office felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in like the sides of a closing book. Emma sat straight-backed in the center chair, Clara to her right, with her hands folded precisely in her lap, and Lucy to her left, swinging her feet in the nervous rhythm that meant she was trying not to cry. The 3 letters on the desk seemed to glow in the morning light streaming through the tall windows, each one representing a different future, a different family, a different ending to their story. "Girls," Mother O'Sullivan began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had delivered this speech too many times before. "These are good Christian families. Each of them can provide opportunities that we simply cannot offer here at St. Catherine's." Emma's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed arguments and pleas in her mind during the long, sleepless nights. But now that it was here, words seemed inadequate weapons against the machinery of adult decisions and practical necessities. "The Henderson family in Great Falls runs a successful general store," Mother O'Sullivan continued, lifting the first letter. "They specifically requested Clara because they need someone intelligent and reliable to help with their bookkeeping. They have 2 children of their own, both younger, and Mrs. Henderson assures me that Clara would be treated as one of the family." Clara's hands remained folded, but Emma could see the slight tremor in her fingers. At 10 years old, Clara understood numbers and logic better than most adults, but she also understood that being treated as one of the family was not the same as being family. "The Morrison family in Billings has a large household and several young children who need care," Mother O'Sullivan said, picking up the second letter. Mrs. Morrison was particularly impressed with Emma's maturity and sense of responsibility. She believes Emma would excel in helping manage their home while receiving an education in domestic arts that would serve her well in the future. Emma felt Lucy's small hand slip into hers under the cover of her skirt. The 7-year-old's palm was damp with nervous perspiration, and Emma squeezed gently, a silent reminder that they were still together, still fighting, still refusing to accept the inevitable. "And the Whitman family in Helena," Mother O'Sullivan concluded, lifting the 3rd letter with what might have been genuine fondness, "are older and have no children of their own. They specifically want a young child to love and spoil. Someone they can send to the finest schools and provide with every advantage. Lucy would want for nothing." The silence that followed was heavy as wet wool. Outside the office windows, snow continued to fall in fat, lazy flakes that seemed to mock the urgency of the moment. Emma could hear the distant sounds of the other children attending to their morning chores, the scrape of chairs being moved in the dining hall, the soft murmur of voices reciting lessons. Normal sounds of a normal day, except that for the Hartwell sisters, this day was fracturing their world into 3 separate pieces. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "We understand that this is difficult," Mother O'Sullivan said, her tone gentler now, "but these families have been waiting patiently for months. The Hendersons are planning to collect Clara next Tuesday. The Morrisons will send their wagon for Emma on Thursday, and the Whitmans—" She paused, glancing at Lucy with something that might have been regret. The Whitmans are traveling through Cedar Falls this very afternoon. They hope to take Lucy with them today so she can be settled in her new home before Christmas. Lucy's hand tightened in Emma's so suddenly and so hard that Emma nearly gasped. Today. They wanted to take Lucy today, in a few hours, before the sun had even reached its peak in the winter sky. Emma felt something cold and sharp lodge itself beneath her ribs, a feeling like drowning in air. "Please," Emma said, the word escaping before she could stop it. "Please don't send us away from each other." Mother O'Sullivan's expression softened, but her resolve remained firm as granite. "Emma, you're 14 years old enough to understand that sometimes we must accept difficult situations for the greater good. These families can provide for you in ways that we cannot. They can give you futures. We can provide for ourselves," Emma said, her voice stronger now, fed by desperation and love in equal measure. "Clara can keep books for any business in the territory. I can work harder than any grown woman. Lucy is 7 years old." Mother O'Sullivan interrupted gently but firmly. "She deserves a childhood, not responsibility beyond her years." Clara spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but clear. "What if we could find a family that wanted all three of us?" Mother O'Sullivan sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of 2 decades spent making impossible decisions. "Clara, we have tried. In 8 months, we have received dozens of inquiries about individual children, but no one is looking to adopt 3 sisters. The reality is that most families can barely afford to feed and clothe their own children, let alone take on 3. Additional mouths to feed. Then we'll work our own way," Emma said, standing abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "There must be someone who needs help enough to take all 3 of us. A ranch, a business, someone who—" A sharp knock on the office door cut through Emma's desperate words. Mother O'Sullivan frowned, glancing at the clock on her desk. "I'm not expecting anyone until this afternoon," she murmured, then called out, "Come in." The door opened to reveal Sister Catherine, her face flushed from cold and exertion, her usually pristine habit dusted with snow. "Forgive the interruption, Mother O'Sullivan, but there's a gentleman here to see you. He says it's urgent." "A gentleman?" Mother O'Sullivan rose from her chair, her brow furrowed. "I have no appointments this morning. He says his name is Samuel Torres, from the Double T Ranch. He's—" Sister Catherine paused, seeming to search for the right words. "He's quite insistent and quite substantial." Emma felt a strange flutter in her chest, as if a bird had suddenly taken flight behind her ribs. Something about the way Sister Catherine said the name, the hesitation before substantial, the unexpected timing of this interruption, made her think of answered prayers and impossible possibilities. Did he say what he wanted? Mother O'Sullivan asked, already moving toward the door. "He said he needs to discuss employment opportunities for older children. He was very specific about that. Older children, plural." The sisters exchanged glances, hope flickering between them like a shared secret. Emma felt Clara's hand join hers and Lucy's, the 3 of them connected in a chain of desperate possibility. "Girls, please remain here," Mother O'Sullivan said, but her tone had changed, become less final, more uncertain. "Sister Catherine, please show Mr. Torres to the front parlor. I'll be with him shortly." When the door closed behind them, the sisters sat in thunderous silence for exactly 30 seconds before Emma stood and moved quietly to the door. She pressed her ear against the wooden panel, straining to hear the voices from the front parlor. "Emma, you shouldn't," Clara whispered, but she made no move to stop her sister. "If someone is here about work for older children, we need to know," Emma whispered back. "This might be our only chance." Lucy had climbed down from her chair and was now pressed against Emma's side, her small face turned up with an expression of fierce concentration. Despite her 7 years, Lucy had developed an uncanny ability to read adult conversations, to understand the currents of meaning that flowed beneath spoken words. The voices from the parlor were too distant to make out clearly, but Emma could distinguish between Mother O'Sullivan's familiar measured tones and a deeper, unfamiliar voice that seemed to rumble like distant thunder. There was something in that voice, even heard through walls and closed doors, that suggested size and strength and a kind of steady certainty that Emma had almost forgotten existed in the adult world. "He sounds big," Lucy whispered, her observation so matter-of-fact that Clara had to press her hand to her mouth to stifle a nervous giggle. Minutes passed like hours. The sisters remained pressed against the door, straining to catch fragments of conversation, trying to piece together the nature of this unexpected visit. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs with a rhythm that seemed to echo the stranger's deep voice, hope and fear warring in her chest with equal intensity. Finally, they heard footsteps in the hallway, and the sisters scrambled back to their chairs just as Mother O'Sullivan opened the door. Her expression was unreadable, but something had changed in her posture, in the way she held her shoulders, as if she had been presented with a problem she hadn't expected and wasn't quite sure how to solve. "Girls," she said, her voice carefully, neutral, "there is someone I would like you to meet." She stepped aside, and the doorway was filled by the largest man any of the sisters had ever seen. Samuel Torres stood at least 6 feet and 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the light from the hallway behind him. His hair was dark brown, threaded with early silver at the temples, and his face was weathered by sun, and weaned into the kind of permanent tan that spoke of a life spent outdoors. His hands, Emma noticed, were enormous but clean, with calluses that suggested hard work rather than roughness. But it was his eyes that caught and held Emma's attention. They were grey-blue, like the sky just before a thunderstorm, and they held, a quality she recognized but hadn't seen in an adult face for a very long time. Genuine kindness without calculation, strength without cruelty, and something that might have been loneliness, carefully hidden but not quite successfully. "Mr. Torres," Mother O'Sullivan said, "these are the Hartwell sisters, Emma, Clara, and Lucy." Samuel Torres removed his hat, revealing hair that was slightly mussed from the wind, and nodded gravely to each sister in turn. When his gaze met Emma's, she felt a strange shock of recognition, as if she were looking at someone she had been waiting to meet, without knowing she was waiting. "Ladies," he said, and his voice was exactly as Emma had imagined from hearing it through the door, deep and warm and careful, like someone who had learned to measure his words because he understood their weight. "I'm pleased to make your acquaintance." Lucy, who had been staring at him with the frank curiosity of childhood, suddenly spoke up. "Are you a giant?" "Lucy!" Clara hissed, but Samuel Torres smiled, and Emma was surprised to see that his smile transformed his entire face, making him seem younger and somehow less intimidating despite his massive size. "I reckon I'm bigger than most folks," he said to Lucy with complete seriousness. "Does that worry you?" Lucy considered this question with the gravity of a judge deliberating a crucial verdict. "No," she said finally. "Big people are usually gentler. It's the small ones you have to watch out for." Samuel Torres laughed, a sound like warm honey poured over gravel, and Emma felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. Anyone who could laugh at a 7-year-old's wisdom, who could take her seriously without talking down to her, was someone worth knowing. "Mr. Torres has come to us with an unusual proposition," Mother O'Sullivan said, settling back into her chair behind the desk. "He owns a large ranch about 50 miles northeast of here, and he finds himself in need of assistance." Emma's heart began to beat faster. The word assistance could mean anything, but the way Mother O'Sullivan said it, the careful pause before it, suggested possibilities that Emma hardly dared to consider. "I run cattle mostly," Samuel Torres said, addressing his words to all three sisters, but somehow managing to make each of them feel individually included in the conversation. "But I've got chickens and horses, a big garden that feeds more people than just me, and a house that's got more rooms than one man knows what to do with." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "The thing is, I'm not as young as I used to be, and the work's getting to be more than I can handle alone. I need help with the day-to-day running of things, but I also need—" He trailed off, looking at Mother O'Sullivan as if asking for permission to continue. "Mr. Torres has expressed a particular interest in providing opportunities for children who might otherwise have difficulty finding placement," Mother O'Sullivan said carefully. "Children who, for various reasons, might be considered challenging to place in traditional family situations." Emma's mouth went dry. Was he talking about them? Was this enormous, gentle-voiced stranger actually suggesting what she thought he was suggesting? "I heard there might be some children here who work well together," Samuel Torres said, his grey-blue eyes moving from Emma to Clara to Lucy and back again, "who might not want to be separated, who might be willing to work hard in exchange for a place to belong." The silence that followed was so complete that Emma could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Clara's careful breathing, could hear Lucy's small foot tapping against the leg of her chair. The moment stretched between them like a bridge that might bear their weight or might collapse entirely, depending on what was said next. "You're talking about all three of us," Emma said, the words emerging as a statement rather than a question. Samuel Torres nodded slowly. "I am." "Together," Clara added, her voice barely above a whisper. "Together," Samuel Torres confirmed. Lucy, who had been remarkably quiet during this exchange, suddenly piped up with the directness that only small children possess. "Would we be your daughters, or would we be your workers?" It was, Emma realized, the most important question any of them could have asked. The distinction between adoption and employment, between family and labor, between belonging and simply being useful, was the difference between hope and despair. Samuel Torres was quiet for a long moment, his big hands turning his hat in a slow circle while he considered Lucy's question. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but clear. "I reckon," he said slowly, "that the answer to that would depend on all of us, on whether we find we suit each other, whether we can build something good together. I'm not looking for workers, exactly, though there'd be work, and I'm not looking to replace a family I never had, though there'd be room for that to grow if it wanted to." He looked directly at Lucy, giving her the respect of a full answer to her full question. "What I'm looking for is partners. People who'd be willing to help me make the Double T Ranch into something more than just a place where one old cowboy counts his cattle and talks to his horses." Emma felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness but from the sudden, overwhelming possibility that their story might not end with separation after all. She glanced at Mother O'Sullivan, trying to read the older woman's expression, trying to understand what this all meant in practical terms. "Mr. Torres," Mother O'Sullivan said carefully, "you understand that these are children. They would require schooling, medical care, proper supervision." "Yes, ma'am," Samuel Torres interrupted gently. "I understand all of that. I've got arrangements with the doctor in Millfield, and there's a school teacher there who's agreed to come out to the ranch twice a week. As for supervision," he smiled again, that transforming expression that made his weathered face seem almost boyish. "Well, I figure these three young ladies have been doing a pretty good job of supervising each other so far." Emma found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Why us? Why three sisters you've never met?" Samuel Torres was quiet for another long moment, and Emma could see him weighing his words, deciding how much truth to share with. Three children who had already heard too many careful half-truths from well-meaning adults. "Because," he said finally. "I know what it's like to be alone when you don't want to be. And I know what it's like to want to belong somewhere so badly that you'd do almost anything to make it happen. I figure if three sisters are determined to stay together, there must be something pretty special about the bond between them. That's the kind of strength I could use on my ranch." He paused, then added with the honesty that took Emma's breath away, "And because I've got a big empty house and too much quiet, and I think maybe we could all use a little less loneliness in our lives." Emma looked at her sisters, saw her own desperate hope reflected in Clara's wide eyes and Lucy's small face. This was it, the impossible possibility, the answer to prayers they hadn't dared to pray out loud, the chance to stay together that had seemed as distant as the stars. But Emma had learned not to trust hope too quickly, had learned to look for the catches and conditions that adults so often attach to their promises. "What would you expect from us?" she asked, her voice steadier now. "What would we have to do to earn our place?" Samuel Torres smiled again, and Emma began to understand that his smiles were not casual things, not automatic responses, but genuine expressions of warmth that he offered carefully and meant completely. "Help me run the ranch," he said simply. "Help me make it a place worth living. Help me figure out how to fill up all that empty space with something good." He looked at each sister in turn, his grey-blue eyes serious and kind. "Emma, I'd need help managing the household, planning meals, keeping things organized. Clara, I'd need help with the books and the business side of things, figuring out how to make the ranch profitable enough to support all of us. And Lucy," he paused, considering the small girl who was watching him with intense concentration. "Lucy, I'd need help remembering how to see the world with wonder instead of just worry." It was, Emma realized, the most honest job offer she had ever heard. Not a list of chores and expectations, but an invitation to become essential, to be needed, not just for what they could do, but for who they were. "When?" Clara asked quietly. "If we said yes, when would we leave?" Samuel Torres glanced at Mother O'Sullivan, who had been listening to this entire exchange with an expression of growing amazement. "Well," he said slowly, "I was hoping today, if you're willing. I've got a wagon outside and supplies for the winter, and there's a storm coming that might make the roads impassable for the next week or so." Emma's heart leapt. Today. He was offering to take them today before the other families could arrive, before they could be separated and scattered to three different futures. Today, if they had the courage to say yes to this giant stranger who spoke of partnership and belonging and filling empty spaces with something good. She looked at her sisters one more time, saw her own desperate hope and careful fear reflected. In their faces, they had survived 8 months of uncertainty, had protected each other through grief and loss and the constant threat of separation. Now they were being offered a chance to do more than just survive. They were being offered a chance to thrive together as partners in building something that had never existed before. Emma took a deep breath, squeezed her sister's hands, and prepared to step into a future that was suddenly, impossibly, full of promise. Emma's hand trembled slightly as she squeezed Clara and Lucy's fingers, the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. The office had grown so quiet that she could hear the tick of Mother O'Sullivan's clock, marking the seconds that stretched between Samuel Torres's offer and whatever words would come next. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows, with increasing urgency, as if nature itself was reminding them that time was running short. "Mr. Torres," Mother O'Sullivan said carefully, her voice cutting through the charged silence, "while your offer is generous, I'm afraid there are legal considerations that cannot be overlooked. These children are wards of the state, and any arrangement for their care must be properly documented and approved by the territorial authorities." Emma felt her heart sink. Legal considerations, territorial authorities, the familiar language of adult complications that could turn hope into red tape and possibility into postponement. She had seen it before when families had shown interest in one or another of the children at St. Catherine's, only to disappear into a maze of paperwork and bureaucratic delays that lasted months. But Samuel Torres simply nodded, reaching into the inner pocket of his heavy wool coat. "Yes, ma'am, I figured as much. That's why I stopped by Judge Morrison's office in town before coming here." He pulled out a folded sheaf of papers, the official seal of the territorial court, visible even from where Emma sat. "Judge Morrison and I go back some years. He's aware of my situation and my capacity to provide for children. These are temporary guardianship papers, good for 6 months while we all figure out if this arrangement suits everyone involved." Mother O'Sullivan accepted the papers with obvious surprise, her eyebrows rising as she scanned the legal language. "This is quite thorough, Mr. Torres. You've clearly given this considerable thought." "Yes, ma'am. I don't make decisions lightly, especially ones that involve children's futures." Samuel Torres's grey-blue eyes moved to Emma, then Clara, then Lucy. "I figure 6 months is enough time for all of us to know if we're suited to each other. If not, well, no harm done. If so—" He shrugged his massive shoulders. "Then we'll talk about making it permanent." Emma found herself studying this enormous stranger who had appeared in their lives like an answer to an impossible prayer. There was something in his careful preparation, in the way he had anticipated every obstacle and addressed it beforehand, that spoke of a methodical mind and a genuine commitment to making this work. But there was also something else, something in the way his eyes flickered when he mentioned being suited to each other that suggested his own vulnerability in this arrangement. "What happens if we don't suit each other?" Clara asked her 10-year-old practicality cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "What happens to us then?" It was, Emma realized, the question that revealed Clara's greatest fear. Not that they would be separated now, but that they would be given hope only to have it taken away later. That they would be sent back to face the same impossible situation. 6 months from now, only older and more desperate. Samuel Torres was quiet for a long moment, his big hand still turning his hat in that slow, thoughtful circle. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but honest. "Well, Miss Clara, I suppose that would depend on why things didn't work out. If it was because you 3 decided you didn't, like ranch life, or didn't want to work that hard, then Mother O'Sullivan and I would have to figure out other arrangements for you." He paused, his gaze moving to include all 3 sisters. "But if it was because I failed to provide what I promised, or because I turned out to be someone other than who I'm presenting myself to be, then I'd consider it my responsibility to help. Find you a situation that would let you stay together. I've got connections throughout the territory, and I give you my word that I wouldn't leave you worse off than you are right now." Emma felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was more security than they had been offered by anyone else. More importantly, it was an honest acknowledgement that the risk in this arrangement went both ways, that Samuel Torres was making himself accountable for their welfare in a way that went beyond legal obligation. "What about school?" Lucy asked. Suddenly, her 7-year-old priorities reasserting themselves. "Emma says I need to learn to read better, and Clara's teaching me numbers." Samuel Torres smiled, that warm expression that transformed his weathered face. "Well, Miss Lucy, I mentioned that Mrs. Patterson from Millfield comes out twice a week for lessons, but I suspect between the 3 of you, you've got enough learning going on already to put most schoolrooms to shame." He looked at Clara. "I hear you've got a head for figures that's better than most grown men. I could use help with the ranch books. But more than that, I could use someone to help me understand how to make the operation more efficient, more profitable." Then his gaze shifted to Emma. And I hear you've got a gift for organizing and managing, for making a little go a long way. The double T has been a bachelor operation for too long. It could use someone who knows how to make a house into a home. Finally, he looked back at Lucy. And someone who remembers that work isn't the only thing that matters, that there's room for wonder and play, and all the things that make life worth living. Emma found herself unexpectedly moved by the way he spoke about their abilities. Not as chores to be assigned or burdens to be managed, but as genuine skills that he needed and valued. It was a perspective she hadn't encountered in the adult world, where children were generally seen as incomplete versions of adults, rather than individuals with their own contributions to make. "Mr. Torres," she said carefully, "what exactly would our status be? Would we be hired hands or wards or—" She trailed off, not quite sure how to articulate the distinction she was trying to make. "That's a fair question," Samuel Torres replied. "Legally, you'd be my wards under the guardianship arrangement. Practically, you'd be my partners in running the ranch. The way I see it, the double T would belong to all of us, and all of us would be responsible for making it succeed." He shifted slightly in his chair, his large frame somehow managing to look both relaxed and alert. "I'm not looking for servants or hired hands. I can hire those if I need them. What I'm looking for is people who'll care about the place the way I do, who'll work to build something lasting because it's theirs to build." Mother O'Sullivan had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, occasionally glancing down at the legal papers in her hands as if to confirm that this conversation was actually taking place. Now she cleared her throat gently. "Mr. Torres, while I appreciate your unconventional approach, I have to ask about the practical arrangements, sleeping accommodations, supervision, the daily structure of their lives." "The house has 6 bedrooms, Samuel Torres said matter-of-factly. "The girls would each have their own space, though I suspect they'd probably end up sharing anyway, at least at first. As for supervision—" He paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, Emma here seems to have been doing a fine job of supervising for the past 8 months. I don't see any reason that should change." Emma felt a flush of pride at his words, followed immediately by a flutter of nervous uncertainty. The idea of being trusted with that level of responsibility was both thrilling and terrifying. At St. Catherine's, her protective instincts had been constrained by the orphanage's rules and Mother O'Sullivan's authority. At the Double T Ranch, it sounded like she would be free to make decisions, to truly care for her sisters in the way she had always wanted to. "What about rules?" Clara asked, her practical mind working through the implications. "What would be expected of us, and what would happen if we didn't meet expectations?" Samuel Torres nodded approvingly, as if pleased by the thoughtfulness of her question. "Good question. I figure we'd need to work those out together, but here's how I see it. Everyone does their fair share of the work that keeps the ranch running. Everyone treats each other with respect. Everyone pulls together when times are tough." He paused, considering. "As for what happens when someone falls short, well, I reckon that would depend on why and how often. We all make mistakes, and we all have bad days. The important thing is that we talk about problems instead of letting them fester, and that we help each other do better instead of just pointing out when someone does wrong." Lucy had been listening to this adult conversation with the intense concentration that she brought to everything important, her small face serious as she processed information that would determine her entire future. Now she spoke up with the directness that never failed to surprise the adults around her. "Are you lonely, Mr. Torres?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, cutting through all the careful negotiations and practical considerations to the emotional heart of the matter. Emma saw something flicker in Samuel Torres's eyes, a moment of vulnerability that he tried to hide but didn't quite manage. "Yes, Miss Lucy," he said quietly. I am." It was such a simple admission, delivered with such honest dignity that Emma felt her last reservations begin to crumble. This wasn't a man looking for free labor or attempting to solve a problem through charity. This was someone who understood loneliness the way they did, who was offering partnership because he genuinely needed what they could provide. "We're lonely, too," Lucy said matter-of-factly. "Even when we're together, we're still lonely because we don't belong anywhere." Samuel Torres nodded slowly. "Then maybe we can figure out how to be less lonely together." The simplicity of it was breathtaking, not promises of love or family or happily ever after, but an honest acknowledgement of mutual need and a shared commitment to building something better than what any of them had alone. Emma looked at her sisters, seeing her own cautious hope reflected in their faces. Clara was studying Samuel Torres with the analytical intensity she brought to mathematical problems, clearly trying to calculate the risks and benefits of accepting his offer. Lucy was watching him with the intuitive wisdom that sometimes seemed far beyond her 7 years, reading the sincerity in his expression and posture. "Mr. Torres," Emma said slowly, "if we agreed to this arrangement, when would it start?" "Today," he replied without hesitation. "I've got a wagon loaded with supplies, and there's a storm coming that might make travel impossible for a week or more. If we're going to do this, we need to leave within the hour." The urgency was both thrilling and terrifying. After months of uncertainty and waiting, suddenly everything was happening at once. Emma felt her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and panic. An hour to pack their few possessions, to say goodbye to the only home they had known for 8 months, to commit to a future with a man they had met less than an hour ago. "What about the other families?" Clara asked. "The ones who wanted to adopt us separately." Mother O'Sullivan spoke up for the first time in several minutes. "I will contact them and explain that alternative arrangements have been made. The Hendersons and Morrisons will be disappointed, but they will understand. The Whitmans—" She glanced at the clock. "The Whitmans are expected within 2 hours. If you accept Mr. Torres's offer, they will arrive to find that Lucy is no longer available." Emma felt a surge of fierce satisfaction at the thought of those well-meaning strangers arriving to discover that Lucy was beyond their reach, safely away with her sisters where she belonged. It was petty, perhaps, but after months of feeling powerless in the face of adult decisions, the thought of choosing their own fate felt like a small victory. "We need to talk," Emma said suddenly, looking at her sisters. "Just the 3 of us. Before we decide." Samuel Torres nodded immediately. "Of course, take all the time you need." But even as he said it, the wind outside grew stronger, rattling the windows with increasing violence. Time was not something they had in abundance, and they all knew it. Mother O'Sullivan stood. "Girls, you may use the small classroom next door. Mr. Torres, perhaps you would like some coffee while you wait." As the adults left them alone, Emma felt the full weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. For 8 months, she had fought to keep her sisters together, had made decisions and sacrifices and compromises, all aimed at this single goal. Now she was being asked to make the biggest decision of all, and she had perhaps 10 minutes to make it. Clara and Lucy were both looking at her expectantly, and Emma realized that despite their individual strengths and contributions, they were still looking to her to guide them through this moment. The thought was both humbling and terrifying. "What do you think?" she asked them, wanting to hear their voices before she shared her own thoughts. "He seems kind," Lucy said immediately, "and sad, but not angry, sad, just lonely sad." Clara nodded, slowly. "The legal paperwork is real, and he's clearly thought this through carefully, but Emma—" She paused, her 10-year-old face serious beyond her years. "What if we get there and he's different than he seems? What if we're trading the problems we know for problems we don't know? It was a valid concern, and Emma had been wrestling with the same fear. There was safety in the familiar misery of St. Catherine's, in the known quantity of their current situation. Samuel Torres represented the unknown, and the unknown was always frightening. But as Emma looked at her sisters, she thought about the alternative. Clara would be on a wagon to Great Falls in 2 days, disappearing into a life of bookkeeping for strangers. She herself would be sent to Billings to manage someone else's household and care for someone else's children. And Lucy would be gone in an hour, taken away to be spoiled and petted and loved by people who would never understand the fierce loyalty that bound the 3 sisters together. "I think," Emma said slowly, "that we're already facing the worst thing. That could happen to us. We're about to be separated, maybe forever. Whatever risks Mr. Torres represents, they can't be worse than that." She reached out and took both of her sisters' hands, feeling the familiar comfort of their connection. "And I think he really does need us. Not just for work, but for the same reason we need each other. Because being alone is harder than facing the unknown together." Clara squeezed her hand. "So we're really going to do this? We're going to trust a stranger and leave the only home we've had since Mama and Papa died?" Emma looked around the small glass room with its worn wooden desks and faded maps, thinking of the dormitory with its narrow beds and thin blankets, of the dining hall with its long tables and carefully rationed meals. It had been a shelter, and they had been grateful for it, but it had never been home. "We're going to trust each other," she said firmly, "just like we always have. We're going to stay together and work together and take care of each other, just in a different place." Lucy nodded solemnly. "And if Mr. Torres turns out to be not nice, we'll figure out what to do. Together." "Together," Clara agreed. Emma felt a rush of love for her sisters so strong it almost took her breath away. They were so young, both of them, but they had learned to be brave in ways that many adults never mastered. They trusted her judgment, because she had earned that trust through months of difficult decisions and protective sacrifices. Now she was asking them to trust her with the biggest decision of all, and they were saying yes without hesitation. "Then we're agreed," Emma said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "We're going to the Double T Ranch with Samuel Torres." As if summoned by their decision, a sharp knock came at the classroom door. Mother O'Sullivan's voice called through the wood. "Girls, Mr. Torres says the storm is moving in faster than expected. If you're going to leave, it needs to be now." Emma stood, her sisters rising with her, their hands still linked in the chain that had held them together through every crisis. Whatever happened next, whatever awaited them at the Double T Ranch, they would face it the way they had faced everything else, together, unafraid, and ready to build something better than what they were leaving behind. The future stretched ahead of them like an unmarked trail, full of possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. But for the first time in 8 months, it was a future they had chosen for themselves, and that made all the difference in the world. The wagon wheels cut deep tracks through the fresh snow as they rolled away from St. Catherine's. The sound, muffled by the thick white blanket that had begun falling in earnest the moment they loaded their meager possessions. Emma sat between Clara and Lucy on the wooden bench behind Samuel Torres, all 3 sisters huddled under a heavy wool blanket that smelled of horses and honest work. Their breath formed small clouds in the frigid air, but Emma felt warmer than she had in months. Behind them, the orphanage grew smaller until it disappeared entirely behind a curtain of swirling snow. Emma didn't look back. She kept her eyes fixed on Samuel Torres's broad shoulders as he guided the 2 sturdy draft horses. Through the storm, his movements sure and confident, despite the deteriorating conditions. Everything they owned in the world was packed into a single carpet bag at their feet. But for the first time since their parents' death, Emma felt like they were traveling towards something rather than running away from it. The journey to the double. T-Ranch took 4 hours through roads that became increasingly treacherous as the storm intensified. Samuel Torres had to stop 3 times to clear fallen branches from their path, his massive frame moving through the snow with surprising grace, as he worked to keep them moving forward. During these stops, he would check on the sisters with genuine concern, asking if they were warm enough, if they needed water from the jug he kept wrapped in blankets, if the ride was too rough for Lucy. It was during the 3rd stop, as Samuel Torres wrestled a large pine branch off the road, that Emma began to understand something about their new guardian that hadn't been apparent during their brief meeting at the orphanage. He worked with the methodical efficiency of someone who had spent years solving problems alone, but he also worked with an awareness of their presence that spoke of genuine care. He didn't simply clear the road and continue. He took the time to pack the snow down so the wagon wouldn't jostle as much, to check the horse's footing, to ensure that his passengers were as comfortable as possible under difficult circumstances. "He really does care about doing things right," Clara murmured, watching as Samuel Torres adjusted the horses' harnesses with careful attention to their comfort. Lucy had fallen asleep against Emma's shoulder despite the cold and the bumping of the wagon, her small body finally relaxing after the stress of the morning's momentous decision. Emma smoothed her youngest sister's hair and found herself thinking about the enormous leap of faith they had all taken. 6 hours ago, they had never heard of Samuel Torres or the Double T Ranch. Now they were traveling through a blizzard to a new home with a man who was still essentially a stranger, trusting their entire future to his word and their own ability to adapt. When the ranch house finally came into view through the swirling snow, Emma's first thought was that it looked like something from one of the picture books their mother used to read to them. It was larger than she had expected, a sprawling 2-story structure built from honey-colored logs with a wide front porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Warm yellow light glowed from multiple windows, and smoke rose from 2 separate chimneys, suggesting that Samuel Torres had been heating the house in anticipation of their arrival. "There she is," Samuel Torres called back to them, his voice carrying a note of pride and affection that Emma found unexpectedly moving. Home. Home. The word hit Emma with surprising force. It had been so long since she had heard anyone use that word to describe a place where she belonged, where she was wanted, where she could imagine building a future. As Samuel Torres guided the wagon up the circular drive to the front porch, Emma felt something tight in her chest begin to unfold like a flower opening to sunlight. The house was even more impressive up close. The front porch was furnished with sturdy wooden chairs and a swing that looked like it could hold all 3 sisters at once. Windows flanked the heavy oak front door, their panes glowing with warm light that seemed to beckon them inside. Everything about the structure spoke of permanence and care, of someone who had built not just a house, but a place where life could flourish. Samuel Torres helped them down from the wagon with the same careful attention he had shown throughout the journey, making sure each sister had steady footing on the snow-covered steps before turning to unload their belongings. Emma noticed that he handled their single carpet bag with the same respectful care he might have shown a trunk full of valuable possessions, as if he understood that their few belongings represented everything they had left of their previous life. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman Emma judged to be in her 50s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and a face that radiated competent kindness. She was wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron, and the scent of fresh bread drifted out to greet them, along with the blessed warmth from inside. "Mrs. Patterson," Samuel Torres said with obvious relief. "Perfect timing as always." The woman smiled, her weathered face creasing into lines that spoke of a lifetime of genuine laughter. "Mr. Torres, you made good time considering the weather, And these must be the young ladies I've heard so much about." Emma felt a moment of confusion. They had been at the orphanage less than 2 hours ago. When had Samuel Torres had time to tell anyone about them? But Mrs. Patterson was already ushering them inside, her maternal instincts taking over as she evaluated their condition with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to caring for others. "Inside, inside, before you all turn into icicles," she commanded gently, shepherding them through the front door into an entryway that was larger than the entire dormitory at St. Catherine's. "I've got hot soup on the stove and fresh bread cooling, and I imagine you're all hungry after that journey." The interior of the house was even more welcoming than the exterior had promised. The entryway opened into a large front room dominated by a stone fireplace where a cheerful fire crackled and danced. Comfortable furniture was arranged to take advantage of both the fire's warmth and the natural light from the large windows. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that looked well-read rather than decorative. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but there was a lived-in quality that made the space feel inviting rather than intimidating. Lucy had awakened during their arrival and was now staring around the room with wide eyes, taking in details that the older sisters were too overwhelmed to notice. "It's so warm," she whispered, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might break the spell of comfort that surrounded them. "Mrs. Patterson has been keeping the house ready," Samuel Torres explained, hanging his heavy coat on a peg by the door. "She comes by twice a week to help with cleaning and cooking, and she's offered to increase that while we all get settled." Mrs. Patterson bustled over to help the sisters out of their thin coats, clucking disapprovingly at the inadequate winter clothing. "These will never do for ranch life," she declared. "We'll need to get you all properly outfitted before this cold snap gets worse." Emma felt a flush of embarrassment about their shabby appearance, but Mrs. Patterson's tone held no judgment, only practical concern. It was the voice of someone identifying problems in order to solve them, not to criticize. "Mrs. Patterson," Samuel Torres said, "I'd like you to meet Emma, Clara, and Lucy Hartwell. Ladies, this is Mrs. Eleanor Patterson. She's the best cook in 3 counties and the finest teacher in the territory." Mrs. Patterson smiled warmly at each sister in turn. "I'm delighted to meet you all. Now let's get some hot food into you, and then Mr. Torres can show you to your rooms while I finish preparing dinner." The kitchen was the heart of the house. Emma realized as Mrs. Patterson led them through a doorway at the back of the main room. It was spacious and efficient, with a large cast-iron stove that radiated warmth, wide counters for food preparation, and a table large enough to seat 8 people comfortably. Copper pots hung from hooks along one wall, and shelves lined with preserves and dry goods spoke of serious food preparation capabilities. Mrs. Patterson ladled steaming vegetable soup into heavy ceramic bowls and set them on the table along with thick slices of bread still warm from the oven. The smell alone was enough to make Emma's mouth water. It had been hours since their meager breakfast at the orphanage, and the stress of the day had sharpened their hunger to an almost painful edge. "Eat," Mrs. Patterson commanded gently, settling them around the table with the efficiency of someone accustomed to feeding hungry people. "There's plenty more where that came from." The soup was rich and satisfying, filled with vegetables and herbs that created flavors Emma hadn't tasted since their mother's kitchen. The bread was dense and hearty, with a crust that crackled when she bit into it. As the warm food filled their stomachs, Emma felt some of the tension she had been carrying for months begin to ease. Samuel Torres sat across from them, eating his own soup with obvious appreciation, while keeping a careful eye on his new wards. Emma noticed that he waited until all 3 sisters had taken several bites before beginning his own meal, a small courtesy that spoke volumes about his character. "Mr. Torres," Clara said during a pause in the eating. "Mrs. Patterson said she was expecting us." "How did you know we would say yes to your offer?" Samuel Torres smiled, that warm expression that transformed his weathered face. "I didn't know for certain, but Mrs. Patterson has been helping me prepare for the possibility. She's the one who suggested that the house might benefit from some younger voices, and she's been working to make sure everything would be ready if you decided to join me." Mrs. Patterson nodded, refilling Lucy's bowl without being asked. "When Mr. Torres told me about 3 sisters who didn't want to be separated, well, it seemed like Providence might be working to solve 2 problems at once." "What do you mean?" Emma asked. Mrs. Patterson and Samuel Torres exchanged a glance that held years of friendship and understanding. It was Mrs. Patterson who answered, her voice gentle but direct. "Mr. Torres has been rattling around in this big house by himself for near on 15 years now. He's got more space than he knows what to do with, and a loneliness that's been eating at him bit by bit. And you 3 girls have been fighting to stay together in a world that seems determined to pull you apart." She smiled. "Seemed like maybe you all needed each other." It was such a simple way of putting it, but Emma found herself moved by the directness of Mrs. Patterson's assessment. No flowery language about charity or Christian duty, just an honest acknowledgement of mutual need and the possibility of mutual benefit. After the meal, Samuel Torres offered to show them around the house while Mrs. Patterson prepared dinner. The tour began with the main floor, which included the large front room they had already seen, the kitchen, a formal dining room that could seat 12, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and Samuel Torres's office where he kept the ranch records and correspondence. "This will be your domain, Clara," he said, gesturing toward a large desk covered with ledgers and papers. "The ranch finances have been getting more complicated as the operation has grown, and I could use someone with your head for numbers to help me make sense of it all." Clara approached the desk with obvious interest, her eyes taking in the neat columns of figures and the careful organization that spoke of someone who took his business responsibilities seriously. "May I?" she asked, reaching toward one of the open ledgers. "Of course, it's all yours now." Emma watched her middle sister flip through pages of entries, her 10-year-old mind already working to understand the patterns and relationships between income and expenses, profit and loss. Clara had always been gifted with numbers, but at the orphanage, her talents had been largely wasted on simple arithmetic lessons that bored her. Here she would have real problems to solve, real contributions to make. The upstairs of the house contained 6 bedrooms, just as Samuel Torres had promised, along with a large bathroom with an actual indoor water closet and a clawfoot bathtub that made Lucy gasp with delight. Emma had never seen such luxury. At the orphanage, they had shared a single washroom with cold water and minimal privacy. "This room is yours, Emma," Samuel Torres said, opening the door to a corner bedroom with windows facing both east and south. "I thought you might like the morning light and the view of the mountains." The room was larger than the entire dormitory at St. Catherine's, with a real bed covered in a colorful quilt, a dresser with a mirror, a comfortable chair by the window, and a small writing desk. Everything was clean and fresh, with wildflowers in a vase on the windowsill and clean towels folded at the foot of the bed. "Clara, this one's yours," Samuel Torres continued, showing them to a room across the hall that was slightly smaller but equally well appointed. "It's got the best light for reading, and it's close to the stairs in case you need to get to the office quickly." Lucy's room was at the end of the hall, painted in cheerful yellow with white curtains that matched the quilt on the bed. A shelf held a collection of books that looked like they might be intended for someone her age, and a rocking chair sat by the window with a basket of yarn beside it, as if someone had been preparing to teach a small girl to knit. "Mrs. Patterson's been busy," Samuel Torres said with obvious affection for the older woman. "She has strong opinions about what children need." Lucy ran to the window, pressing her nose against the glass to look out at the snow-covered landscape. "I can see the barn from here," she announced, "and there are horses." "Would you like to meet them?" Samuel Torres asked. "After dinner, if the storm lets up, we can visit the barn. I've got 6 horses right now, and they're all friendlier than most people." For the next hour, Samuel Torres showed them the practical aspects of their new home. How to work the pump in the kitchen that brought water directly into the house from a well. How to adjust the dampers on the fireplaces to control the heat. Which stairs creaked and which doors stuck in humid weather. Where the emergency supplies were kept in case of severe storms. It was clear that he was sharing information rather than just giving a tour. Treating them as new residents who would need to understand how their home functioned rather than as guests who would be leaving soon. Emma found herself paying careful attention to every detail, already mentally organizing the information and thinking about how to establish routines that would keep the household running smoothly. As evening approached, Mrs. Patterson called them back to the kitchen for dinner. The meal was a feast compared to anything they had eaten in months. Roasted chicken with herbs, mashed potatoes rich with butter, green beans from the garden that had been preserved for winter, and apple pie that made Lucy actually moan with pleasure. "Mrs. Patterson," Emma said during a brief pause in the eating, "this is wonderful, thank you." The older woman smiled, but Emma noticed that she kept glancing at Samuel Torres, as if measuring his reaction to having his large, quiet house suddenly filled with young voices and laughter. After dinner, the storm had indeed lessened enough for a quick visit to the barn. Samuel Torres led them through the snow, carrying a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the white ground. The barn was warm and filled with the comfortable sounds of horses shifting in their stalls, the scent of hay and leather, and the indefinable smell of healthy animals. "This is thunder," Samuel Torres said, stopping at the first stall where a massive black gelding hung his head over the door to investigate the visitors. "He's my riding horse, though he's getting too old for long days on the range." Lucy approached the horse with the fearless curiosity that had served her well with the strays at the orphanage. Thunder lowered his great head and allowed her to stroke his velvet nose, his eyes half closing with pleasure at the gentle touch. "He likes me," Lucy announced with satisfaction. "Animals have good judgment about people," Samuel Torres said seriously. "If Thunder likes you, it's because you've got a good heart." They met the other horses. Belle, a gentle mare with a coat like polished copper. Storm, a young stallion with more energy than sense. Duchess, an older mare who had been Samuel Torres's first horse when he started the ranch. Ranger, a working horse who helped with the cattle. And Penny, a small pony who had belonged to the previous owner's children and had been looking for someone new to love. "She's perfect for you, Lucy," Clara observed, watching as the little girl and the pony seemed to immediately understand each other. "Can I ride her?" Lucy asked, her eyes bright with hope. "Tomorrow," Samuel Torres promised. "After the storm clears and we've had time to get properly acquainted. Horses are partners, not tools, and partners need to know each other before they work together." As they walked back to the house through the falling snow, Emma felt a sense of rightness that she hadn't experienced since before her parents' death. The house glowed with warm light from multiple windows, smoke rose from the chimneys in cheerful spirals, and somewhere inside, Mrs. Patterson was probably banking the fires and setting bread to rise for tomorrow's breakfast. It felt like home. Not because it was perfect or because all their problems had been magically solved, but because it was a place where they belonged, where they were wanted, where they could build something together that none of them could have created alone. That night, as Emma lay in her own room in her own bed for the first time in 8 months, she could hear the soft sounds of the house settling around her. Clara's quiet breathing from across the hall, Lucy's occasional murmur as she dreamed, the tick of the grandfather clock in the front room, the whisper of snow against the windows. But underneath all of these sounds was something else, the absence of fear. For the first time since their parents' death, Emma fell asleep without worrying about tomorrow, without planning for catastrophe, without the constant low-level anxiety that had become her normal state. They were home. They were together. They were safe. And tomorrow they would begin the real work of building a life worth living. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp February morning, 6 weeks after the sisters had settled into their new life at the Double T Ranch. Emma was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, when she heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, too many and too fast for a friendly visit. Through the frost-covered window, she watched a group of 5 riders crest the hill that overlooked the ranch, their horses breathing steam in the cold air as they paused to survey the property below. Samuel Torres emerged from the barn where he had been feeding the horses, his massive frame moving with the careful alertness of a man who had learned to read danger in the set of strangers' shoulders and the way they held their reins. Emma saw him glance toward the house, a quick check to ensure his wards were safe, before walking out to meet the riders with his hands visible and empty, but his posture radiating quiet strength. "Clara, Lucy," Emma called softly, not wanting to alarm them, but needing them close. "Come to the kitchen, please." Her sisters appeared quickly, Clara with a ledger still in her hands, and Lucy trailing a ball of yarn from the knitting project Mrs. Patterson had started teaching her. Both girls read the tension in Emma's voice and moved to the window without being asked, their faces growing serious as they took in the scene unfolding in their front yard. The lead rider was a man Emma recognized from their few trips to Millfield for supplies, Harrison Blake, who owned the largest ranch in the county and had a reputation for getting what he wanted through a combination of money, influence, and intimidation. He was a lean, sharp-faced man with cold eyes and an expensive coat that spoke of wealth accumulated at others' expense. Torres, Blake's voice carried clearly across the yard, his tone holding the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Heard you've taken in some strays." Samuel Torres planted his feet wider, his stance becoming more solid and immovable. "Mr. Blake, what brings you to my property?" Blake dismounted with theatrical precision, his 4 companions remaining mounted, in a formation that suggested this was not a social call. Emma noticed that all 5 men wore gun belts, and while their weapons remained holstered, the message was clear enough. "Well now, that's an interesting question," Blake said, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. "See, I've been doing some research into territorial records, and I've discovered something that might interest you." Emma felt her stomach clench with familiar dread. In her experience, when adults began conversations with phrases like territorial, records, and might interest you, children's lives were about to be disrupted in ways they couldn't control. Samuel Torres remained silent, waiting for Blake to reveal his hand. Emma found herself admiring her guardian's patience. He didn't rush to fill the silence or demand explanations, just stood like a mountain waiting for the storm to exhaust itself. "Turns out," Blake continued, clearly enjoying his moment of dramatic revelation, "that these 3 little girls you've collected aren't actually orphans at all. They've got a living relative who's been looking for them, an uncle, in fact, who's mighty concerned about their welfare." Emma's blood turned to ice. Uncle Jerome, their father's younger brother, who had disappeared years before their parents' death amid whispers of gambling debts and questionable associates. They had never met him, had heard his name spoken only in hushed tones when their parents thought the children weren't listening. "Is that so?" Samuel Torres's voice remained level, but Emma could see the tension in his shoulders. "And where might this concerned uncle be?" Blake smiled, an expression that held no warmth. "Why, he's right here in the territory, been searching for his poor orphaned nieces ever since he heard about the tragic loss of his brother and sister-in-law. Imagine his distress when he discovered they'd been misplaced by the territorial authorities." One of Blake's companions, a thick-set man with scars on his knuckles, leaned forward in his saddle. "Mighty convenient that they ended up with you and Torres, 3 able-bodied workers, just when you needed help with this big empty ranch." Emma saw Samuel Torres's hands slowly curl into fists. the only sign of the anger that must be building inside his massive frame. "I have legal guardianship, papers properly filed and approved by Judge Morrison. If there's a legitimate claim to be made, it can be made through proper channels." Blake laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, we're not here to discuss legalities, Torres. We're here to discuss what's right, and what's right is for these children to be with their blood family, not with some lonely old bachelor who's playing house with little girls who don't belong to him." The insult was deliberate and calculated, designed to provoke Samuel Torres into doing something rash that would give Blake's men an excuse to escalate the confrontation. Emma held her breath, watching her guardian's face for signs of the explosion. That seemed inevitable. Instead, Samuel Torres smiled. It was not his usual warm expression, but something colder and infinitely more dangerous. "Mr. Blake, I'm going to give you one chance to get off my property before this conversation takes a turn you won't like." Blake's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Is that a threat, Torres?" "No, sir," Samuel Torres replied calmly. "It's a promise." The two men faced each other across 20 feet of snow-covered ground, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Emma could see that Blake's companions were growing restless, their hands drifting closer to their weapons, their horses shifting nervously in response to their riders' increasing agitation. Clara grabbed Emma's hand, her fingers cold and trembling. "Emma, what if Uncle Jerome really is here? What if he has legal rights to us?" Emma's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Even if their mysterious uncle's claim was fraudulent, even if Blake was manufacturing the entire story for reasons of his own, the mere existence of a legal challenge could disrupt their carefully built new life. Courts moved slowly, and while cases were being decided, children could be placed in temporary custody arrangements that might separate them just as effectively as adoption by different families. "We need to get word to Judge Morrison," Emma whispered. "If there's really a legal challenge, Samuel needs help." But even as she said it, Emma realized the isolation that had made the Double T Ranch feel so safe now worked against them. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and Blake's men controlled the only road between the ranch and town. Lucy, who had been unusually quiet during this exchange, suddenly spoke up with the clarity that sometimes surprised adults. "Emma, what if we don't let them take us? What if we just say no?" It was such a simple question, but it cut to the heart of the matter. For months, the sisters had been passive recipients of adult decisions about their fate. They had been moved from home to orphanage to ranch, based on other people's needs and other people's choices. But Lucy's question raised a possibility that Emma hadn't considered. What if they refused to be passive anymore? Outside, the confrontation was escalating. Blake had produced another document, apparently some kind of official-looking paper that he was waving in Samuel Torres's face, while his mounted companions spread out in a semicircle that suggested they were preparing for violence. "This here's a writ of custody, signed by a territorial magistrate," Blake was saying, his voice carrying the false authority of someone reading from a script. "Gives Jerome Hartwell the right to collect his nieces immediately, pending a full hearing on their custody." Samuel Torres took the paper, his movements deliberate and careful. Emma watched him read it, saw his jaw tighten as he processed whatever legal language it contained. "This is dated 3 days ago," Samuel Torres said finally. "Funny how it took so long to reach us, considering how urgent the situation supposedly is." Blake shrugged. "Legal documents take time to process. Point is, it's valid, and you're required to surrender the children immediately." "Like hell I am." The words came out flat and final, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Emma felt a surge of fierce pride in her guardian, followed immediately by terror at the implications of his refusal. Blake's smile widened. "Now, Torres, I'm trying to keep this civilized. But if you're going to obstruct a legal process, well, that puts you on the wrong side of the law." And if you're trying to use forged documents to kidnap children, Samuel Torres replied evenly, that puts you on the wrong side of a rope. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Emma saw Blake's companions exchange glances, their hands now openly resting on their gun butts. The pretense of legality was crumbling, revealing the naked intimidation beneath. Careful what you're accusing me of, Torres, Blake said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. A man could get hurt making wild claims like that. Mr. Blake. The new voice came from behind the mounted men, calm, and carrying the kind of authority that made everyone turn to look. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the tree line where the road curved toward town, riding her sturdy mare with two men flanking her on either side. Emma's heart leapt as she recognized the riders. Dr. Marcus Webb, the physician who had been treating ranch families in the area for 20 years, and Deputy Sheriff Tom Crawford, a steady man whose presence meant that help had arrived at exactly the right moment. Mrs. Patterson, Blake said, his confident demeanor faltering slightly, this is private business. Is it now? Mrs. Patterson dismounted with the efficiency of someone half her age, her eyes taking in the scene with shrewd assessment. Because it looks to me like you're harassing my neighbors. Dr. Webb had already dismounted and was walking towards Samuel Torres, his medical bag in hand and his face grim with professional concern. Sam? You all right? Mrs. Patterson said there might be trouble. Deputy Crawford remained mounted, but his position gave him a clear view of all the participants in the confrontation. His hand rested casually on his sidearm, and his presence had immediately changed the dynamics of the situation. Deputy, Blake said, forcing his voice back to its earlier confident tone, good thing you're here. I've got a legal writ for the custody of 3 children, and Mr. Torres is refusing to comply. Crawford held out his hand. Let me see that writ. Blake hesitated for just a moment before handing over the document. Crawford read it carefully, his weathered face revealing nothing. Finally, he looked up with an expression of mild curiosity. Mr. Blake, this document appears to be signed by Magistrate Harrison. Problem is, Magistrate Harrison died 6 months ago. Kind of hard for a dead man to issue custody orders. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma saw Blake's face cycle through several expressions as he tried to process this unexpected development. His companions were looking increasingly uncomfortable, apparently realizing that they had been involved in something more serious than simple intimidation. That's impossible, Blake stammered. I obtained that document through proper channels. No, sir, Crawford interrupted firmly. What you obtained is a forged legal document, which makes this attempted kidnapping a federal crime. Now, I'm going to give you and your friends exactly 1 minute to get off Mr. Torres's property before I start making arrests. Blake's carefully constructed plan was crumbling around him, but Emma could see that he wasn't ready to retreat without making some kind of threat. This isn't over, Torres. There are other ways to settle disputes about children's welfare. Yes, there are, Samuel Torres replied calmly. They involve actual courts and real judges and evidence instead of intimidation. Feel free to pursue any of those options. Blake remounted his horse with less grace than he had dismounted, his movements sharp with frustration and anger. You think you're protected because you've got friends in town, but protection doesn't last forever. Accidents happen on isolated ranches. It was Deputy Crawford who responded to this thinly veiled threat. Mr. Blake, I'm going to pretend I didn't hear you threaten a citizen in my presence. But if anything unfortunate happens to the Torres family, I'll know exactly where to start my investigation. Blake and his companions rode away without another word, but Emma could see the fury in their retreat. This had been a coordinated attempt to seize the sisters, and its failure would not be easily forgiven or forgotten. As the dust settled from the departing riders, Mrs. Patterson approached the house while the men remained outside to discuss the legal implications of what had just occurred. Emma opened the kitchen door to let her in, grateful for the older woman's steady presence in the aftermath of the confrontation. "Are you girls all right?" Mrs. Patterson asked immediately, her maternal instincts taking over as she checked each sister for signs of distress. "We're fine," Emma said, though her hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the past hour. "But Mrs. Patterson, how did you know to bring help?" The older woman smiled grimly. "I didn't get to be 60 years old in this territory without learning to recognize when men are up to no good. I saw Blake and his crew riding toward the ranch this morning, and something about the way they were moving told me they weren't coming for a social visit." Clara, who had been quietly processing the morning's events, spoke up with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Mrs. Patterson, do we really have an Uncle Jerome? And if we do, does he have legal rights to us?" Mrs. Patterson settled into a kitchen chair, her expression thoughtful. "Well now, that's something we'll need to investigate. Your guardianship papers are legal and proper, but if there's a blood relative with a legitimate claim, that could complicate things." Lucy, who had been unusually quiet throughout the crisis, suddenly spoke up with the directness that never failed. "To surprise adults, what if Uncle Jerome is real but he's bad? What if he sent those men because he wants to hurt us?" It was a possibility that Emma had been trying not to think about, but Lucy's innocent question forced them all to confront it. If their uncle was working with Harrison Blake, if he was the kind of man who would use forged documents and intimidation to seize children, then his motives were unlikely to be purely familial. Through the kitchen window, Emma could see Samuel Torres deep in conversation with Dr. Webb and Deputy Crawford. Their body language suggested serious discussion about legal strategies and protective measures. The sight of her guardian working to defend them filled Emma with a fierce gratitude. That was stronger than any fear Blake's threats might have inspired. "Girls," Mrs. Patterson said gently, "I want you to understand something important. What happened here today was not about law or family or children's welfare. It was about power and money and men who think they can take what they want through intimidation." She paused, looking each sister in the eye. "But here's what they didn't count on. You're not alone anymore. You've got Samuel, who would fight a mountain lion bare-handed before he'd let anyone hurt you. You've got me and Dr. Webb and Deputy Crawford and half the county who've come to think of you as family." Emma felt tears prick at her eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that they had built something worth defending. 6 weeks ago, they had been 3 frightened orphans with no one to protect them except each other. Now they were part of a community surrounded by adults who were willing to stand between them and danger. "More than that," Mrs. Patterson continued, "you've got each other and you've got voices. You're old enough to speak for yourselves, to tell any judge or magistrate or official exactly where you want to be and who you want to be with." It was a revolutionary idea. Throughout their time at the orphanage, the sisters had been treated as objects to be moved around according to adult decisions. The possibility that they might have agency in their own fate, that their preferences might carry legal weight, was both thrilling and terrifying. The kitchen door opened, and Samuel Torres entered with the other men close behind. His face was grim but determined, the expression of someone who had accepted a difficult challenge and was preparing to meet it head-on. "Girls," he said without preamble, "we need to talk about what comes next." Emma straightened, her protective instincts automatically engaging. Whatever Samuel Torres was about to say, whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them. They all were. Because Mrs. Patterson was right. They weren't alone anymore, and they weren't powerless anymore. They were the Hartwell sisters of the Double T Ranch, and they had found their home. Whatever threats emerged from their past, whatever dangers, lurked in their future, they would face them together, surrounded by people who cared enough to fight for them. Harrison Blake had made a serious mistake when he had targeted them. He had assumed they were still the same frightened orphans who had arrived at St. Catherine's 8 months ago. But those children no longer existed. In their place stood 3 sisters who had learned what it meant to belong somewhere, to be valued for who they were rather than what they could provide, and they were not going anywhere without a fight. The evening after Blake's confrontation, the Torres household gathered around the kitchen table in what had become their ritual of shared planning and honest conversation. The legal documents that Deputy Crawford had left behind were spread across the scarred wooden surface alongside Clara's carefully maintained ranch ledgers and Emma's lists of household improvements. But tonight, the usual business discussions felt secondary to the deeper questions that Blake's attack had forced them all to confront. Samuel Torres sat with his massive hands wrapped around a coffee cup, his grey-blue eyes reflecting the lamplight, as he studied the 3 sisters who had transformed his quiet ranch into something resembling a real home. 6 weeks of shared meals and daily routines had created a comfortable familiarity between them, but the morning's crisis had stripped away the careful politeness that still sometimes marked their interactions, leaving behind something more raw and honest. "I need to tell you about my brother," Samuel said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had been wrestling with difficult truths. "About why I never married, never had children of my own, and why this ranch meant everything, and nothing to me before you 3 arrived." Emma felt Clara and Lucy go still beside her, their instinctive understanding that this was one of those moments when an adult was about to share something that would change how they saw the world. She had learned to recognize these moments during the long nights when their mother had talked about their father's illness, when difficult truths had to be spoken because pretending otherwise had become impossible. "I had a younger brother named David," Samuel continued, his eyes focused on something beyond the kitchen walls, somewhere in a past that Emma could see still caused him pain. "He was 5 years younger than me, and after our parents died in a wagon accident when I was 22, he became my responsibility." Samuel paused, taking a slow sip of coffee as if the warmth could fortify him for what came next. David was different, not simple, but gentle in ways that the world doesn't always appreciate. He saw beauty where other people saw problems, found joy in small things that most folks take for granted. He was the kind of person who would spend an hour watching clouds change shape and think it was the most wonderful thing he'd ever seen. Lucy leaned forward, her 7-year-old heart immediately connecting with the story of someone who found magic in ordinary things. "He sounds nice." "He was," Samuel said, his voice soft with remembered affection. "He was the best person I've ever known, and that's probably why I failed him so completely." Emma felt her chest tighten with familiar dread. In her experience, when adults began stories with that tone of voice, they ended with loss and regret, and the kind of wounds that never fully healed. "I brought David West with me when I decided to start this ranch," Samuel continued. "Figured the open spaces and clean air would be good for him, that he could find peace here. And for a while, he did. He loved the horses, loved watching the cattle graze in the pastures, loved helping Mrs. Patterson with her garden when she came to visit." Samuel's hands had tightened around his coffee cup, and Emma could see the slight tremor that suggested how difficult this story was for him to tell. "But I was young and impatient, and convinced that I knew what was best for everyone. I thought David needed to toughen up, to learn to defend himself, to become more like other men his age." Clara, with her gift for seeing patterns and connections, spoke quietly. "What happened to him?" Samuel was silent for so long that Emma began to wonder if he had decided not to finish the story. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. There was a man named Jacob Winters, who owned a ranch about 30 miles south of here. He had ideas about how the territory should be run, about who belonged and who didn't. He took a particular dislike to David, said a man who acted like a child had no business trying to run cattle in a serious country. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February wind rattling the windows. She was beginning to understand where this story was leading, and she could see that her sisters were reaching the same terrible conclusion. "Winters came here one day when I was in town getting supplies," Samuel continued, his voice flat with old pain. He told David that simple-minded folks like him were a danger to themselves and others, that they belonged in institutions where they could be properly cared for. He had papers with him, documents that he claimed gave him the authority to take David away for his own protection. Lucy gasped, the parallels to their own recent experience hitting her with devastating clarity. The papers were fake, like the ones that man had about us. Samuel nodded grimly. "I found out later that Winters had bribed a corrupt clerk to forge custody documents, just like Blake tried to do with you three. But David didn't know that. He trusted adults to tell him the truth, believed that if someone had official papers, they must be acting legally." Emma's hands had clenched into fists without her realizing it, her protective instincts responding to a threat that had occurred 15 years before she was born. "Did he go with them?" "He tried to resist," Samuel said, and Emma could hear the self-recrimination that still haunted him. But Winters had brought 3 men with him, and they weren't gentle about convincing David to cooperate. "When I got home that evening, I found the house torn apart and David gone. The silence that followed was heavy with grief and understanding." Emma found herself thinking about how differently that morning's confrontation might have ended if Samuel Torres hadn't been there to protect them, if Mrs. Patterson hadn't arrived with help, if Deputy Crawford hadn't been available to expose Blake's forged documents. "I tracked them for 3 days, Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger as he moved toward the part of the story that had shaped him into the man sitting across from them. "Found Winters' camp just before dawn on the 4th day. David was tied to a tree, beaten and scared, but alive." Clara's mathematical mind immediately grasped the implications. "You were 1 man against 4. Samuel's smile was grim and entirely without humor. "I was 1 man who had failed to protect his brother, facing 4 men who thought they could take whatever they wanted through violence and intimidation. The odds weren't as bad as they seemed." Emma found herself leaning forward, caught up in the story despite its painful elements. "What did you do?" "I waited until they were all asleep, except for 1 guard," Samuel said matter-of-factly. "Then I walked into their camp and gave them a choice: ride away immediately and never come back, or explain to the territorial marshal why they had kidnapped a man with forged documents." "And they chose to leave?" Lucy asked, her voice full of hope for an ending where the good people won and the bad people were punished. Samuel shook his head slowly. "Winters was too proud and too stupid to back down. He drew his gun and told me I could take David's body back to bury. But that was all I'd be taking." The kitchen grew so quiet that Emma could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the front room, marking seconds that seemed to stretch like hours. She found herself holding her breath, waiting for Samuel to continue a story that she both needed and dreaded to hear. "I killed him," Samuel said simply, his voice carrying neither pride nor shame, just the flat statement of fact. "Shot him dead where he stood. The other 3 men decided they had urgent business elsewhere and left me to untie David and bring him home." Emma felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow at this revelation. Satisfaction that David had been rescued and his tormentors punished. Sorrow that Samuel had been forced to carry the weight of taking a life, even in defense of someone he loved. "David lived for another 2 years after that," Samuel continued, his voice growing softer. "Good years, peaceful years, He helped me build this house, planned the garden with Mrs. Patterson, learned to read well enough to enjoy the books in the library. But the experience with Winters had changed something in him. He was more fragile, more easily frightened, and I spent those 2 years walking on eggshells, trying to protect him from a world that seemed determined to hurt gentle souls. Clara asked the question that Emma was afraid to voice. How did he die? Pneumonia, Samuel said, and Emma was surprised by the relief she felt that David's death had been from illness rather than violence. It came on suddenly during a hard winter, and there wasn't much the doctor could do. David died here in this house, in his own bed, surrounded by people who loved him. Samuel paused, looking around the kitchen that had been David's favorite room, because it was where Mrs. Patterson taught him to bake bread and where the morning light fell across the table just right for reading. Before he died, David made me promise something. He made me promise that I wouldn't let what happened to him make me bitter, that I wouldn't close off this house and this ranch to people who might need a safe place to belong. The words hung in the air like a bridge between past and present, connecting David's story to their own in ways that made Emma's chest tight with emotion. "That's why you came to get us," she said, understanding flooding through her. "Not just because you were lonely, but because you made a promise." Samuel nodded slowly. David believed that home wasn't a place, it was a feeling. He said that feeling was too important to waste on just one person, that it should be shared with anyone who needed it. He looked at each sister in turn, his grey-blue eyes warm with affection that was no longer carefully hidden. When Mrs. Patterson told me about 3 sisters who refused to be separated, who were willing to fight the whole world to stay together, I heard David's voice telling me that this was what he meant. Lucy had been unusually quiet during this story, but now she spoke with the clarity that sometimes made adults forget she was only 7 years old. "David sounds like he would have liked us. He would have loved you," Samuel said without hesitation. "All 3 of you. Emma's fierce protection of her sisters, Clara's brilliant mind that finds solutions where others see only problems, Lucy's gift for seeing wonder in ordinary things." He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion. "You 3 have brought life back to this house in ways that I'd forgotten were possible." Emma felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that they had not just found a guardian in Samuel Torres, but had somehow helped heal wounds that had been festering for 15 years. "Is that why you were so ready to fight Blake this morning? Because of what happened to David?" Samuel's expression darkened, his jaw setting in lines that reminded Emma of the dangerous calm he had shown during the confrontation. "No man will ever again take someone I care about, using forged papers and intimidation, not while I have breath in my body and strength in my hands." The simple declaration carried such absolute conviction that Emma felt a shiver of something that was part fear, part gratitude, and part fierce pride in the man who had claimed them as family worth defending. "But there's something else you need to understand," Samuel continued, his voice growing serious. "Blake's attack this morning wasn't random. He's been asking questions about this ranch, about me, about why 3 orphan girls would end up here. Someone's been feeding him information, and that someone has reasons for wanting you 3 away from here." Clara's analytical mind immediately began working through the implications. "You think there really is an Uncle Jerome?" "I think there might be," Samuel admitted. "And if there is, I think he's the kind of man who would ally himself with someone like Blake to get what he wants, which means this morning was just the beginning." Emma felt the familiar cold grip of fear in her stomach, but it was different now than it had been at the orphanage. Then she had been afraid because they were powerless and alone. Now she was afraid because they had something precious to lose, something worth fighting to protect. "What do we do?" she asked. Samuel leaned forward, his massive hands covering hers across the table. We do what David would have wanted us to do. We stand together, we tell the truth, and we make this house and this ranch so strong that no one can tear it apart." He looked at each sister in turn, his expression serious, but warm. "But I need you to understand something important. This fight isn't just about keeping you safe from Blake, or from Uncle Jerome, or from anyone else who might try to take you away. It's about choosing what kind of family we want to be." Emma felt her heart begin to race as she sensed that Samuel was building toward something significant, something that would change their relationship in fundamental ways. For 6 weeks, we've been living as guardian and wards, as partners in running a ranch, as people who care about each other but haven't quite figured out how to say it out loud, Samuel continued. That worked when we were all getting to know each other, when we needed time to see if we suited each other. He paused, his grey-blue eyes reflecting the lamplight as he searched for words to express something that had clearly been growing in his heart. "But after this morning, after seeing how ready you three were to stand with me against Blake, after watching Emma organize our defense and Clara think through the legal implications and Lucy ask exactly the right questions, I don't want to be your guardian anymore." Emma's stomach dropped. Was Samuel Torres preparing to send them away after all? Had the morning's confrontation convinced him that they were too much trouble, too much risk? But Samuel's next words turned her fear into something entirely different. "I want to be your father," he said simply. "Not just legally, not just on paper, but in every way that matters. I want you to be my daughters. Not because you need a home, but because I need you to be my family." The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. It was full rather than empty, charged with possibility rather than fear. Emma looked at her sisters and saw her own overwhelming joy reflected in their faces. "Would that mean we could stay forever?" Lucy asked, her voice small but hopeful. "Even when we grow up?" Samuel's laugh was warm and rich with genuine happiness. "Lucy, this will always be your home, no matter how old you get or where life takes you. Family doesn't end just because children become adults." Clara, ever practical, asked the question that Emma was thinking but hadn't dared to voice. "What about our real parents? What about keeping their memory alive?" Samuel's expression grew gentle and understanding. "Your parents will always be part of who you are, and their memory will always be honored in this house. I'm not trying to replace them. I'm asking if you'll let me add to the love they gave you, if you'll let me be part of your story going forward." Emma found her voice at last, though it came out slightly choked with emotion. "You already are part of our story. You have been, since the moment you walked into Mother O'Sullivan's office." She looked at her sisters, seeing in their faces the same certainty that was filling her own heart. "We don't just want you to be our guardian, Samuel. We want to be your daughters. We want to be a real family." The word family hung in the air between them, no longer a memory of what they had lost, but a promise of what they were building together. Emma felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, settling into place of pieces that had been scattered for too long. Samuel Torres reached across the table and gathered all three sisters into an embrace that was awkward due to the furniture, but perfect in every way that mattered. For the first time since their parents' death, Emma felt completely safe, completely loved, and completely certain about where she belonged. They were no longer the Hartwell sisters, orphans looking for a place to survive. They were the Torres daughters, ready to build a future worth having with a father who had chosen them as deliberately as they had chosen him. And whatever challenges Blake or Uncle Jerome or anyone else might bring, they would face them as a family, united by something stronger than blood or law or circumstance. They were bound by choice, by love, and by the promise that home was not a place, but a feeling that they would protect with everything they had. Spring arrived at the Double T Ranch with an explosion of wildflowers and new possibilities. The snow that had blanketed the land during the sisters' first months in their new home gave way to green pastures where cattle grazed peacefully and horses ran free in the warming air. But the most dramatic transformation wasn't in the landscape. It was in the confidence and sense of belonging that radiated from three young women who had learned what it meant to be truly wanted, truly valued, and truly home. Emma stood on the front porch in the early morning light, watching as Clara rode out to check the northern boundary fence with the kind of easy competence that would have seemed impossible just 4 months ago. At 11 years old, Clara had become Samuel's most trusted partner in the business side of the ranch, her mathematical mind turning what had been a profitable but modest operation into something approaching prosperity. The ledgers that had once confused even Samuel were now organized with a precision that impressed visiting ranchers and merchants alike. In the distance, Lucy was leading a group of 3 children from neighboring ranches in what she called horse school, teaching them how to approach the animals with respect and confidence. At 8 years old, she had developed an almost mystical connection with every creature on the ranch, and families from 50 miles around had begun bringing their children to learn from the small girl who could gentle the wildest colt with nothing but patience and understanding. As for Emma herself, at 15 she had become the heart that kept the household running smoothly, not through the desperate efficiency of a child trying to earn her place, but with the confident grace of a young woman who knew she belonged exactly where she was. The kitchen that had once been Mrs. Patterson's domain was now shared territory, where Emma's growing skills complemented the older woman's experience in creating meals that nourished both body and spirit. The legal challenges that had threatened to tear them apart had been resolved 3 weeks ago in a courtroom in Helena, where Judge Morrison had listened to testimony from Samuel, Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Webb, Deputy Crawford, and most importantly, from the 3 sisters themselves. Emma would never forget the moment when the judge had asked them directly where they wanted to live and with whom they wanted to spend their futures. "We want to stay with our father," Emma had said clearly, looking Judge Morrison directly in the eye. "Samuel Torres is our family now, and the Double T Ranch is our home." Clara and Lucy had spoken with equal certainty, their voices steady and sure as they described the life they had built and the man who had given them not just shelter, but belonging. Judge Morrison had listened with the kind of attention that suggested he understood the weight of their words, the significance of children, who spoke of choice rather than necessity. The mysterious Uncle Jerome had indeed materialized, just as Blake had claimed. But when he appeared in court, it became clear why he had been using intermediaries like Blake to press his claim. Jerome Hartwell was a broken man whose gambling debts and association with questionable characters had made him desperate for any source of income, including 3 nieces whose labor could be sold to the highest bidder. The judge's decision had been swift and final. The sisters would remain with Samuel Torres, who would become their legal father through formal adoption. Uncle Jerome's parental rights were terminated, and a restraining order was issued to keep both him and Harrison Blake away from the Double T Ranch permanently. But the true victory hadn't been in the courtroom. It had been in the moment when they returned home from Helena to find the entire community of neighbors and friends gathered on their front lawn for what Mrs. Patterson had organized as an adoption celebration. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by families from across the county. Musicians had brought fiddles and guitars for dancing, and children ran between the adults with the kind of joyful energy that marked truly happy occasions. "You know," Samuel said, joining Emma on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "I keep expecting to wake up and find this has all been a dream." Emma accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich scent that had become one of her favorite parts of these quiet morning conversations with her father. "Father," The words still sent a warm glow through her chest every time she thought it. "It doesn't feel like a dream to me," she said, settling into the porch swing that Samuel had hung specially for these morning talks. "It feels like the first real life I've ever had." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the ranch came alive around them. The sound of horses whinnying in the pasture, the lowing of cattle in the distance, the cheerful chaos of Lucy's impromptu riding lessons, all of it combined into a symphony of belonging that Emma had never imagined possible. "Emma," Samuel said, eventually, his voice carrying the careful tone that meant he was about to say something important. "There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you. About your future, about what you want to do with your life as you get older." Emma felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, the old fear that changes meant loss, that discussions about the future meant disruption of the present, but she forced herself to remain calm, to trust in the love and security that Samuel had spent months proving to her. "Mrs. Patterson has been talking to some people at the Territorial College in Bozeman," Samuel continued. "She thinks you have the mind and the temperament for higher education, maybe even for becoming a teacher yourself someday." The suggestion hit Emma like a physical shock. Education beyond basic literacy had always seemed like something for other people, for children whose futures were secure enough to include such luxuries. The idea that she might have options, might have choices about what kind of adult she wanted to become, was almost too large to comprehend. I don't know what to say," Emma admitted. "I never thought about anything like that being possible for someone like me." Samuel turned to face her fully, his grey-blue eyes serious and warm. "Emma, you're not someone like you anymore. You're my daughter, and my daughters get to dream as big as they want and work as hard as they're willing to make those dreams come true." Before Emma could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced Clara's return from her fence inspection. But instead of the steady, measured pace of routine ranch work, Clara was riding hard, her horse kicking up dust clouds as she pushed for maximum speed. Emma and Samuel were both on their feet before Clara reached the house, their instincts alert to the possibility of trouble. But when Clara pulled up at the porch, she was grinning with excitement rather than fear. "Samuel!" she called, swinging down from her horse with practiced ease. "You need to see what I found at the north boundary." "What is it?" Samuel asked, but Clara was already turning her horse around, clearly expecting them to follow her. "It's easier to show you than tell you," Clara said, her 11-year-old face bright with the kind of discovery that comes once in a lifetime. "But I think we might be about to become a lot more prosperous than we ever imagined." Emma and Samuel exchanged glances, then Samuel went to saddle horses, while Emma called for Lucy to join them. Within minutes, the entire Torres family was riding north across their own land, following Clara toward whatever discovery had put such excitement in her voice. The north boundary of the Double T Ranch was marked by a line of cottonwood trees that followed the meandering path of Willow Creek. It was here, where the creek made a sharp bend around a cluster of large boulders, that Clara led them to what looked like nothing more than a small depression in the earth. "Look closer," Clara urged, dismounting and kneeling beside what Emma now realized was a natural spring bubbling up from deep underground. Samuel knelt beside his daughter, cupping the clear water in his hands and tasting it carefully. His expression changed from curiosity to amazement to something approaching awe. "Sweet water," he breathed. "Cold, clean, sweet water in the middle of cattle country." Emma didn't immediately understand the significance, but Lucy's excited gasp suggested that even an 8-year-old grasped what this discovery meant. "This means people will want to bring their cattle here," Lucy said, clapping her hands together, "and they'll pay us to let them use our water." Clara nodded eagerly. "I've been reading about water rights in the territorial law books. Springs, like this, especially ones that flow year-round, are worth more than gold in ranch country. We could charge drovers for watering their herds, or we could expand our own operation significantly." Samuel stood slowly, his eyes taking in the implications of what his daughters had discovered. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "This makes the Double T Ranch one of the most valuable properties in the territory." Emma felt a surge of excitement that was quickly followed by a more complex emotion. Financial security was wonderful, but it also meant that their quiet, protected life might become more complicated, might attract the kind of attention that had always spelled trouble for the Hartwell sisters. "Samuel," she said carefully, "does this mean we'll have to change how we live? Will there be more people around, more complications?" Samuel's expression grew thoughtful as he considered her concerns. "It could, if we let it. But here's the thing about having choices, Emma. We get to decide how we use opportunities like this. We could become a major commercial operation, or we could use this discovery to make our current life more secure without fundamentally changing what we've built." Clara was already thinking through practical applications, her mind working with the swift precision that made her such a valuable partner. "We could offer water access to a limited number of trusted ranchers, charge enough to ensure our financial security, but not so much that we attract every desperate drover in the territory. And we could use the income to improve the ranch, maybe build a proper school building so Mrs. Patterson could teach more children," Lucy added, her young mind immediately jumping to ways the discovery could benefit others. Emma felt a warm rush of pride in her sisters, in their instinctive understanding that prosperity should be shared rather than hoarded, that success meant lifting others up rather than protecting what they had from outside influences. "There's something else," Samuel said, his voice growing serious. "Water rights this valuable will attract attention from people like Blake, people who think they can take what they want through intimidation or legal manipulation. We'll need to be very careful about how we handle this discovery." Emma felt the familiar cold touch of fear, but it was different now than it had been during their early days at the ranch. Then she had been afraid because they were vulnerable and alone. Now she was concerned because they had something precious to protect, not just the water rights but the life they had built around them. "What do we do?" she asked. Samuel smiled, the expression carrying confidence and determination in equal measure. "We do what the Torres family always does. We work together, we make smart decisions, and we protect what matters most." Over the following weeks, Samuel worked with lawyers in Helena to ensure that their water rights were properly documented and legally protected. Clara dove into research about water law and commercial agreements, her mathematical mind helping to structure deals that would provide steady income without overwhelming their operation. Lucy continued her work with the horses and visiting children, her natural gifts creating a reputation that brought families from increasing distances. Emma found herself caught up in planning for the future in ways that would have been impossible just months before. The security of knowing that their financial needs would be met allowed her to think seriously about education, about what kind of woman she wanted to become, about how she could use her own gifts to build something meaningful. The transformation was visible not just in their daily lives, but in how the community saw them. No longer were they the 3 orphan girls who had been taken in by the lonely bachelor rancher. They were the Torres daughters, valuable members of a prosperous and respected family who contributed to the well-being of everyone around them. Mrs. Patterson had begun including Emma in her teaching duties, recognizing a natural ability to connect with younger children and explain difficult concepts in ways they could understand. Dr. Webb had started training Clara in basic bookkeeping for his medical practice, impressed by her mathematical skills and attention to detail. Even Lucy had found ways to contribute beyond her work with animals, her gift for seeing beauty in ordinary things, leading to a small but thriving business, selling pressed flower arrangements to families throughout the county. On a warm evening in late May, as the family gathered on the front porch to watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Emma found herself thinking about the letter she had written during that desperate night at St. Catherine's Orphanage. She had written, "To anyone who might be willing to give three sisters a chance to prove they were worth more together than apart." Samuel Torres had been the answer to that letter, even though he had never received it. He had seen in them exactly what Emma had tried to describe: three individuals whose combined strengths created something greater than the sum of their parts. He had given them not just a home, but a future, not just security, but the freedom to dream. "You know," Samuel said, settling into his favorite porch chair with a satisfied sigh, "I keep thinking about David, about what he would say if he could see us now." Emma smiled, thinking about the gentle brother whose memory had guided Samuel toward them. "What do you think he would say?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant with affection for someone Emma would never meet, but had learned to love through his brother's stories. "I think he would say that home isn't a place, it's a feeling, and that feeling is too important to waste on just one person." Lucy looked up from the kitten she was cuddling, her 8-year-old wisdom cutting straight to the heart of things, as it always did. "Does that mean we should find more people who need homes?" The question hung in the evening air, full of possibility and hope. Emma looked at her sisters, at the man who had become their father, at the ranch that had become their sanctuary, and felt her heart expand with the kind of love that multiplied rather than divided when shared. "Maybe we should," she said softly. "Maybe that's exactly what we should do." As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the Torres family sat together in the comfortable silence of people who knew they belonged exactly where they were. They had traveled from desperation to belonging, from survival to prosperity, from fear to love, but most importantly, they had learned that family wasn't something you were born into. It was something you chose to build, day by day, choice by choice, with people who saw your value and were willing to fight to protect it. The Double T Ranch had become more than a successful business or a comfortable home. It had become a place where love multiplied, where broken things could be healed, where children who had been told they were burdens could discover they were blessings. And in the months and years that followed, it would become a refuge for others who needed to learn the same lesson that the Torres family had discovered, that home wasn't a place on a map, but a feeling in your heart that said you were exactly where you belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.